Welcome to panel 2 of day 3 in Gaza Tribunal. Our panel is titled Exposing Dehumanization. My name is Jamil Aydin, Professor of History at North Carolina Chapel Hill, and I will be honored to moderate this panel. As Professor Ilan Pape noted at the end of the last panel, there is a close connection between the Israeli project of Zionism and the European crisis of anti-Semitism, Europe's problem. And this all led to the famous line in the Balfour Declaration that the British Empire will create a national home for the Jews of Europe as a form of colonial settlement, which came at the expense of the destruction of Palestinian home, figuratively as a homeland, but also actual homes. And all our panelists will deal with this dehumanization and the question of Palestinian home and its destruction. Our first panelist is Professor Jeff Halper, who is the director of Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, and he will talk about his paper called Challenging the Matrix of Control and House Demolition. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, it's good to be here. It's actually not true. I'm not going to talk about the matrix of control in order to explain why Gaza is happening. You know, I think what's been really great about these last couple of days with the tribunal is that the people span, you know, from the purely academic to academic, you know, with very much of a political focus to try to contribute some academic analysis to the understanding of what's happening. You know, Phyllis talked about the role of civil society yesterday, and I'm sort of that other end of the spectrum, and that is I'm an academic, an engaged anthropologist, who's very much involved in I'm not at the university anymore. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and very much involved in the political process of trying to come to a resolution of all of this, not only protest and analyze and resist and so on, but you know, I'm also a member of a Palestinian-led group called the One Democratic State Campaign. So what I want to do today is kind of something, I'm not going to say anything you don't know. And Penny's analysis of genocide, you know, is much more detailed than what I'm going to present. What I'm going to present is what I kind of present to the public, because advocacy is very important. If civil society, you know, it's not enough. I don't completely agree with Phyllis, actually. It's not enough to mobilize civil society. Civil society has to be mobilized in a way that is focused, that it knows what the problem is, that it can advocate in the halls of power or on the media, you know, in an articulate way, not only that we're against this or this, but they have to be able to articulate what the issue is. And at the same time, and this is really what's lacking, we have to have a political program. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's, you know, all this is going towards, you know, to what end? The question really has to be to what end? So what I want to do is just show you a little bit how I would explain Gaza, and in a sense, try to get people to understand the logic. If we can get them to understand the logic, then they get it. And now they can, when new things happen in Gaza, there's new news, there's a new development, somebody says something, they're able to plug that in because they get the logic of what's going on in terms of Zionist settler colonialism. So where I only have a few minutes, so I can't really go into detail. Where I begin is we can't use the term, we should stop using the term conflict. And what's been very gratifying the last 2 days is I don't think I've heard the word conflict. So we're all aware of that it's the wrong framing, it's a destructive framing because it creates this false symmetry between the colonizer and the colonized. And of course, it has its own logic and its own dynamic that leads to two-state solutions and other kinds of unjust and unworkable ideas. But rather, I try to name exactly what we're engaged in that I frame as a struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. And then I see the settler colonial movement as having four. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to present it. I mean, there's 6 phases, and there's, everybody has an analysis, but and they all fit in together. But to help people understand it in kind of a more not simplistic way, but in a way that they can use it, especially if we're talking to people that aren't academics. I say there's 4 stages of Zionist settler colonialism. The first stage is unilateral invasion and settlement. And the unilateral part is very important because, again, conflict begins to assume 2 sides. There's 2 sides, and the sides have to negotiate. And what the conflict model does, of course, is it elevates Zionism to a legitimate side, where, as we all know, colonialism is never legitimate. It's always illegal, immoral, unjust. And to elevate it to a side is a historical injustice and certainly unhelpful politically, and at the same time making the Palestinian people, indigenous people living in their country, a side that now has to somehow compromise and defend its right even to be in the country is of course unacceptable. So to emphasize settler colonialism is unilateral, and in many ways the Palestinians are irrelevant to it. The Zionists had their own agenda. As Elon said, it was a European project, and they came in to take over the land. And so you can see even in the pattern of Zionist settlement before 1948, you already begin to see the modern map of Israel and the West Bank beginning to emerge at that time. The second stage of settler colonialism is, of course, the transformation of an Arab country into a Jewish country. And here, Penny's talked about in many cases how the legal system and legal terminology is inadequate. And I think here's a good case of that. The best term, it is a term we almost never use and never hear, for capturing the essence of what Zionism is all about, what the settler colonial project is all about, is Judaization. And it's a term that the Zionist movement used. It's a term that's used officially today. We're Judaizing the Galilee. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. We're Judaizing Palestine. That term is especially important because it captures more than any other term I know exactly what the purpose of Zionism and what the goal of Zionism is. So if you're going to explain particular events like or processes like Gaza, or like settler colonialism, or where Israel is going, or how can we resolve this, if you don't understand the concept of Judaization as the basis of it, you don't get it. I don't think any other term gives that comprehensive understanding of where exactly this whole what this whole project is and where it's going. And of course, the flip side of Judaization is de-Arabization. And you can see very much the process, I mean, we all know this, the process of Judaization, of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country. And of course, this is all, it continues today. Here's the map of already the plan for resettling Gaza, that the settlers have developed. Now, the fourth phase, now, I know I skipped the third, and I skipped the third in a way for a reason, not in a way, I skipped it for a reason, that I'll come back to in a second. The end game of settler colonialism is normalization. In other words, this is another term that we almost never hear. Certainly you're not going to go mobilize masses of people in the streets of London around normalization. It's a gray, dry, academic-sounding term, but it's tremendously important. It's no less important. I would say Judaization and normalization are the bookends of understanding settler colonialism. Settler colonialism has an end, and its end is not the defeat of the indigenous population in any dramatic way or any military sense like Gaza. You know, Gaza is a part of the process. Settler colonialism ends almost like the T.S. Eliot poem, you know, not with a bang, but with a whimper. It ends by being normalized. It's just normalized. It becomes, you know, the perception of what reality is. It's on the map. It's the way everybody looks at the country. It's now Israel, and Palestine is erased. So that a normalization is a closure. You know, and that I think, because I put this within the political context, there's a disconnect between our political work and what's happening on the ground politically. In other words, all the organizations I work with, civil society organizations all over the world, including inside Palestine and Israel, our own organizations, we all have our agendas, we have our timetables, we have our meetings, we have our completely disconnected from what's happening. And you hear all the time, even from Palestinians, this isn't the time to talk politics. I begin many of my talks by apologizing or acknowledging the genocide that's happening, because people say it's inappropriate to talk about a political solution at a time of genocide. First, we deal with the genocide, and then we deal with all this other political stuff. But it doesn't work that way. We have to multitask. The world does not stop its political motion just because it doesn't fit our timetable. I was in a meeting of our One Democratic State group a couple days ago where people are talking about, well, maybe in another year we'll declare ourselves a political movement. I mean, there's a complete disconnect. There's an urgency here that somehow is missing in our discussions and so on. Normalization is happening. You know, the Trump plan is going through. This is Netanyahu in the United Nations on the podium of the General Assembly 2 weeks before October 7th, showing the map of the new Middle East, where he was on the cusp of signing with, Saudi Arabia, was on the cusp of entering into the Abraham Accords, the new Middle East, as Elon says, in an unabashed way, Israel presents a greater Israel. It's not hiding anything. The settler colonial project isn't something that's hidden in the dark. It's in our faces. And I think that's also where Israel wins, because if it's able to get Europe and the United States and the Arab countries and others to accept what's actually going on, and not, they don't have to play games either. Everybody's up front in terms of that, and that, I think, is the essence of the normalization project. Normalization means a greater Israel, as you can see on the map, and normalization, of course, means a two-state solution, which is actually two-state apartheid, because Palestinians have to be locked into a little Bantustan on 15% of the country. So normalization is the end, in a way. I mean, we have to really think about this, and this is coming down the pipeline. Because after normalization, there's very little political space left. Palestinians will come and say, well, wait, we're locked in a Bantustan, non-viable state, non-sovereign state, so-called state, and so on. What about our rights? And the world's going to say, hey, we've normalized. It's over. We've moved on to Sudan. We still have Ukraine to deal with. The Palestinian issue is removed from the international agenda. So there's a real urgency and danger, and I think we haven't focused on that part of the settler colonial project. We focus more on how it works, but how it's resolved and how that is being resolved in real time today is something that I think we have to focus on more. And of course, normalization isn't hidden in any kind of a way. Trump presented a plan in 2020 of exactly where he's going with normalization. Since then, there's another couple 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, and Gaza has been destroyed. So this map is probably an optimistic map of what a normalized two-state apartheid would look like. But of course, in this plan of normalization, there's no territorial contiguity for Palestinians, no sovereignty, no economic viability. And of course, the refugees are unable to return. And, when we talk about normalization, pacification, the annihilatory phase of settler colonialism, I mean, it's right in front of us in terms of Gaza. And this is the third part, because pacification has to precede normalization. That's the process. Normalization is stuck today because Saudi Arabia, and MBS says this. MBS said to Blinken, and we all know the quote, "I don't care about the Palestinians, but I have a younger generation that does." So what the Arab governments need, and especially Saudi Arabia, is a period of industrial quiet before it's able to enter into a normalization agreement with this greater Israel. And that's the stage. That explains Gaza, from my point of view. Genocide, as many people have emphasized, is a process. And it began from the very beginning of the settler colonial project. Genocide is built into settler colonialism, as we all know. And it's had its more violent, vicious, intense periods, and its more quiescent periods where it goes on, but sort of under the radar and in less violent ways, maybe like settlement and so on. Why is it culminating today? Why do we have Gaza today? And the Gazification of the West Bank, let's not forget that, because of the normalization process. We can't disconnect our analysis from the political processes. Settler colonialism isn't only a process where we can name the different phases. The phases have a timetable. The phases take certain forms according to how close we're getting to the culmination of it all, which is normalization. And that, I think, explains Gaza today and the West Bank. And that is that as Israel has this opportunity with Trump to normalize, it's got to break the Palestinian resistance forever, right? And it has to introduce this period of industrial quiet that will then pave the way for and enable the normalization process to take place. You have Rafah, you've got the West Bank, the refugee camps, you've got the ethnic cleansing. I actually sent another PowerPoint, but it doesn't matter. And so that, I think, is the, begins to explain Gaza within the context of not only the process of settler colonialism and the resistance to it, but also in the context of the political process of normalization that we're in today. So if I would, just at the end, kind of summarize where we are in the struggle for Palestinian liberation against settler colonialism, we're really towards the end here. In other words, what Penny has mentioned as the annihilatory phase of settler colonialism, the pacification, the breaking of resistance, and so on, were there. And then moving into the last phase, which is normalization, and then you've got this conclusion of the settler colonial project, I think. On the other hand, of course, and I don't have time to talk about this, you've got the Palestinian resistance that also develops and organizes as the settler colonial project begins. We can't focus only on the settler colonial project, on its own. We have to look at how it's reacting to Palestinian resistance and how Palestinian resistance is reacting to the settler colonial project. And I think we're at the stage now, and then I go back to the point I made before, where resistance has been strong all these years. You know, we've had the resistance in Gaza the last couple of years, in the refugee camps now. Resistance takes different forms. But at some point, there's got to be a political program. There cannot be, you can't be in a political struggle without a political program. And without a political program, we're unable to summon power. The Palestinians, I believe, have the ability to summon the power to effectively fight against the settler colonial project. You know, we see the mobilization in the world for Palestinians, but what they're lacking is the summoning of power. And in some ways, the resistance has kind of been left alone. I mean, here, the resistance is going on, but our side of it, the academics, the intellectuals, the political people, those that can take the resistance and move it into a political program and become political actors, we're falling down on the game. We are not picking up our end of the struggle, I think, and that's the problem. So whether the Palestinians summon power and what the political program will be, that has to be a political program that addresses the logic of settler colonialism. We'll see. But this, I think, is where we are today. So I'll leave it at that. And
Great presentation. I will move to the next speaker, and hopefully we will have a conversation to discuss these. Our next paper is by Professor Nadira Shahub-Kevorkian, but because of her health, she's not here with us, and her paper will be read by Professor Penny Green. Nadira is a Palestinian Jerusalemite feminist whose scholarship on the settler colonial states' brutality, unchilding, securitized and sacralized politics, state crime, law, and society and global feminist politics challenges the epistemic violence against Palestinian people. She's a professor extraordinaris at the University of South Africa and a global chair in law at Queen Mary University in London. Penny? We will read the paper.
Thank you, Jamil, and it's an honor to be here reading Nadira's work. She's a dear friend, a very dear friend and colleague. I'm not going to read the full paper because it's rather too long, so I have tried to just capture the essence of what she is attempting to say here very powerfully. And before I begin, I just want to define, and you know, it was a new term for me as a non-Arabic speaker, but she uses the term a lot in the paper, ashla. For those Arabic speakers, you will know it means bodily remains. I think that's right, isn't it? So I'll begin Nadira's paper. In this talk, I plan to trouble or unsettle the ways genocide studies has engaged with ongoing genocide in Palestine and the political power embedded in invoking genocide. To begin, I must state that what guides my theorization are Palestinian voices and testimonies from the beginning of the Nakba in 1948 through to the ongoing genocide today. Palestinian voices, like the voice of Fatme, the Gazan mother that went viral in October 2023 when she went to get food for her children, only to come back and find their scattered body parts, ashla. As she said, "My kids died hungry. I went to get them food and came back to find them ashla." Body remains, scattered all over the place. Ashla, hungry. My kids died hungry. I also speak from the unheard voices of Gazan newborns, left to decompose in incubators in November 9, 2023 in Al Nasser Hospital ICU ward. CNN reported, and I quote, "The tiny bodies of babies, several still attached to wires and tubes that were meant to keep them alive, decomposing in their hospital beds, milk bottles and spare diapers still next to them on the sheets." My analysis of the ongoing genocidal Nakba stages the centrality of death and overkill apparent in the ashla of decomposed babies in incubators and Fatme's dismembered ashla of her children. It brings to our view the ordinary terror inhabiting the most vulnerable bodies of newborns and children and most vulnerable spaces, homes, schools and hospitals, reducing children and newborn bodies into decomposed, dismembered objects that can be used to support the larger project of demarcating the ontological boundary between the human and the non-human that should be shredded, decomposed and killed to disappear it at the centre of my analysis. The genocidal brutality of indiscriminate attacks to kill, including leaving newborns abandoned in incubators, inscribes both in the flesh and Zionist consciousness that Palestinian bodies can and should always be in a state of death and overkill. Such inscription of power on babies' flesh, as on the Palestinian flesh of men and women, old and young, that I ontologically link their slowly dying bodies to the settler colonial state. As Fanon has explained, the notion of ontological difference involves seeing below the notion of being and even below the notion of non-being. Hence his insistence on talking about the colonized and the tensions that emerge in the flesh land, and I would say the cut, scattered, burned flesh and bones. Seen through the prism of the incomprehensible ashla, the racialized being, voided of life, is deprived of his or her humanity, and Palestinian unwholeness is maintained and extended. The violent horrors we are seeing in Gaza over the past 20 months have made us witnesses to the strangulation of newborn babies, a strangulation that demands their submission to the occupying power. What we have witnessed through these horrors is part of the Israeli necropenological global and local regime. We witnessed another glimpse just recently, this month, through the intentional starvation of Palestinian children and their communities by Israeli expansionist greed. Another blatant example of Israel's necropenological regime happened on May 5th, 2025, when a group of Israeli soldiers filmed themselves blowing up a building in Gaza, using the colour blue for the gender reveal meant to celebrate the birth of the settler's child. This horrific act of celebration, while abandoning newborns in incubators, bombing entire families while at home or in their tents, in hospitals while caretaking, the indiscriminate assassinations of doctors, journalists, educators, and more, reveals the hunger for Palestinian unending death. It is from the silent voices of those shredded newborn babies as ashla, and through the necropolitical brutality of the gender reveal, using the Palestinian ashla, that I read the brutality of the occupier. It is against this deadly enfleshed ontology and the centrality of death in this ontology that I read the scattered body parts, the ashla, the decomposed babies' overwhelming presence as a strong voice to guide my analyses. My ontological analysis is guided through the figurative occupation and possession of the decomposed Palestinian body. It is on this body that we can read the Zionist wanton use of violence to understand the centrality of death, killing and overkilling of the settler colonial project. The emotions of pleasure and joy expressed by Israeli soldiers during the gender reveal in May that I just mentioned expresses the Zionist colonizer ideology. This ideology rejoices over Palestinian maiming, death and suffering. As they literally blew up Palestinian bodies, the soldiers celebrated by chanting, "It's a boy." What does this suggest about Zionist ideology? That soldiers can and do celebrate in the exact moments they destroy the colonized geography and home. This convergence of violence and pleasure, so spectacularly live-streamed, demonstrated through the gender reveal bombing, with its monstrosity, exposes the local and global ontological politics and dilemmas facing genocide studies today. Palestinian dispossession and death as a result of Zionism reveals a genocidal economy, an economy embedded in white supremacy, white racism, that dispossesses Palestinian humanity, even the newborn babies, with its codes, technologies, aesthetics, and visuality. This is what enables the ongoing genocide and its ontological consumption. The genocidal economy is constituted through the enmeshment of ashlar and the viscerality of it living in such a scale of death and the geopolitics of racism. It's rooted in the colonial state's commitment to violence and its exercise of power over the non-human, always killable Palestinian body. An ontological stand that can be detected in all aspects of the settler colonial genocidal criminalities of the state. Under such conditions, Palestinian ashlar becomes more visible in the settler state's infinite desire for expansion, even over shredded or sick bodies, empty stomachs, and collective graves. Palestinians are always kept in a state of neither life nor being. This enduring ontology depends on attacking the wholeness, integrity, and continuity of the Palestinian body and land. It has turned Gaza and Palestine into a collective graveyard for slow and fast death, a slaughterhouse of maiming and wounding for the political functioning of the state, and hence the continuous Nakba. I'm going to conclude Nadira's piece with the following paragraph. I stand against the settler colonial assertion of turning the Palestinian body, flesh, geography, and economy into a death zone. This stand grounds my analysis as a criminologist and a scholar. My imperative is not the illegal apparatus, nor the human rights conventions, but rather human life, dignity, integrity, and futurity of the people. I also do not believe in the system of the state or the security of the state. The people are my centre. Thank you.
Thank you to Nadira and Penny. Our third speaker in this panel is Professor Henrietta Zeppert, whose paper is titled The Unmaking of the Palestinian Home. She's a lecturer in the School of Law, University College Cork, Ireland. Henrietta's writings draws inspiration from feminist, post-colonial, and geographic theory and global socio-legal methods. Prior to joining her current academic institution, Henrietta was a lecturer at the University of Leeds, a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, and a doctoral candidate at the London School of Economics. Henrietta founded an organization called Right Now in 2004. Henrietta?
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank the tribunal organisers, and I'm honoured to be here with you all. It's difficult to follow Nadira's very difficult paper, but I hope you'll find some synchrony between her paper and mine. Ooh. So, home, Homi Bhabha said, is the site for history's most intricate invasions. That history of uncontrolled entry into, destruction of, and expulsion from home in Palestine extends over a much longer period than the current annihilation, and even longer ago than the Nakba. Nonetheless, the intensity of home destruction in Gaza over the last 20 months and the depth of human suffering associated with it is massive and unparalleled. It prompted the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing to call it domicide, the deliberate, widespread and systematic destruction of home. We've all seen the imagery that shows that over 70% of Gaza's infrastructure has been levelled. By May this year, 92% of Gaza's homes have been destroyed, and we just saw Jeff's devastating image from Rafah. Israel's calculated attacks on home have displaced almost everyone, as we've heard over the last few days, generally multiple times. These statistics are so familiar as to have become tired, but it is crucial to still collect and reflect on this data, as this tribunal well knows. That data cannot be overlooked because it points to where and how international law and its institutions are deficient, even complicit, but also more optimistically, where it could do better. And these are themes I'm going to dwell on today in relation to home. Home is tangled with systems of violence and logics of erasure. As we all know, home is an organising metaphor for settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the story of homes that are themselves tools of destruction, homes that have been constructed on the ruins of other homes. Settler colonialism is a project of homemaking and home unmaking, as Raja Sharani and Jeff have reminded us with the settlements that spawn and now threaten to swallow Gaza. But the unmaking of home is not just about physical homes, it's also about the very sense of home and of spatial attachments. The severing of connection to a place that is called home is profoundly devastating. And we've heard in the first chamber on Monday a number of witness testimonies in which Gazans stressed the psychological and immaterial losses and pain associated with the destruction of their homes. One witness said that losing a home means losing your mental stability. Another said they had no horizon for hope after they had lost their home. To borrow from Penny's words, the destruction of home is a form of mass weakening and cultural erasure. The centrality of home to the logics of occupation, apartheid and genocide, and the complex role of home as both a site of violence and control, as well as agency and resistance, is important to understanding what's going on now in Gaza. In the early months, when there were still homes standing, the IDF used maps carving Gaza up into numbered neighbourhoods, indicating which homes would be targeted. Weaponising homes in this way, the maps transformed Gaza into the unhomely, an unfamiliar place of not belonging, of fear, of alienation, so far from the ideal of a safe and cosy home. As the airstrikes menaced street by street, home by home, we were reminded that home is contested ground. That far from being a neutral space, home is where struggles over the very nature of identity unfold. Denied full agency and control over home, the conditions of home and for being at home in the world are radically altered. The pain of domicide extends not only to those whose homes have been destroyed, but also to those who cannot return home, and because everything needed to make home has been obliterated. Gaza has become, to borrow from Nadara, a nowhere home. And yet, Gaza, Palestine, remains home. The concept of sumud, which Ramzi so eloquently introduced to the tribunal yesterday, captures this. Sumud means rootedness in land, a stubborn standing, a steadfast refusal to leave home and homeland, and defiance through acts of homemaking, of hospitality, of accommodation, and of dreaming of home. Similarly, as Lara Ebono powerfully reminded us to do yesterday, that despite the destruction of home, it must be part of our activism and part of our resistance to showcase the beauty, creativity and art, the culture and design riches of Gaza and Gazans. And I hope that this photo does a little bit of that with the beautiful lights and the decorating you can see here in the interior of this Gazan home. I've said the word home a lot, but let me explain a little bit more what it means. It's much more than a place in which we live. It's a complex, multidimensional concept comprising an array of feelings and experiences. It is at once a material, affective, and imaginative space. In its most expansive sense, home is being and belonging in the world, To quote Nadera again, it's a psychological and epistemological space of yearning, of radical thinking and belonging. The process of making home, of homing, is one of becoming, of carving out our own socio-spatial identity. And this is, of course, why Palestinian homes have always been targets of destruction, and this is why Edward Said observed that the history of Palestine read through its homes is one of an open door, of others getting in, of being entered into despite us, lived in despite us. For Palestinians, home is a place, a powerful idea and an organising force. It is homeland, memory and identity. As Nadera and Sarah Immoud write, the Palestinian home is saturated with individual and collective cultural and political meanings. For Fatma Kassem, home is a place where history and memory are transmitted, preserving and continuing cultural and national identity and the idea of a Palestinian homeland. The homeland may be an artificial construction, mobilised, for example, in discourses of nationalist exclusion and violence, which we heard about yesterday from Haida and today from Jeff with the South African Bantustans. But the concept of homeland does remain critical for understanding territorial claims, modes of ethno-national spatial control, and how space is planned, settled, and transformed, including the smaller space of home. Feminists have shown us that home is problematic, but it is nonetheless difficult to exorcise what is so positive about home. Most of us look forward to going home at the end of the day, and we invite others to make themselves at home. And many of you in our conversations this week have reminded me of the irrepressible hospitality of Palestinians in their homes. Nonetheless, the ideal or idealised home that is safe, bounded, closed, exclusive and static in time is far from the reality of home. That reality is far more contingent and provisional and messy. I think it's better to think of home as a place of contest and negotiation and shifting boundaries, of histories of estrangement and becoming, of permeability and material impermanence, and a dynamic process of rearticulation, of making, unmaking, and remaking. Next slide, please. Despite the unprecedented level of home destruction taking place in Gaza today, we all know that international law has been unable to stop it. In fact, international law and its institutions has very little to say about home, what home means and what it is to lose a home. Home is not explicitly protected in international law. It can be derived or implied from particular provisions and rights, such as the right to housing, property and privacy. We see something like the idea of homeland in the recognition of Indigenous peoples' spiritual connection to land. The laws of war prohibit targeting civilian property and civilian objects, which we can take to mean home. Yet home is so far from a derived experience. Home is real life. Home is embodied. Home is emplaced. Home is multiple. Most of us would say that home is in a few different places. Home is mobile. We carry it with us across place and time. It is present, past, and future. As Sarah Ahmed writes, home is storytelling, colonialism, racial discrimination, class relations, and the politics of gender. And so it is that home, as a central aspect of liberation praxis, has remained invisible in modern international law and its conversations, with its patriarchal conceptions of struggles for justice, self-determination and statehood, and its roots in colonial order. But this does not mean that international law is inactive in the space of home. I argue that it is already present at home, shaping and defining the contours and conditions of home in myriad ways. In other words, international law does homemaking and home unmaking work. That homemaking is thresholding and bordering work, shaping space and contouring and determining identity. It is, for example, the international laws of war that provide for and sustain the legal architecture of occupation and makes no apology for it. Even if that occupation has been condemned by the ICJ, as we know, in essence, that international legal framework opens the door, as Edward Said said, to enter into and control Palestinian homes. There are also more subtle metaphorical and philosophical equivalences between home and international law that diagram its home unmaking work in Palestine. The nation state is frequently analogized as a home, the state as home. So claims to statehood, sovereignty, territory, and self-determination are often grounded physically and imaginatively in the language of home and homeland. Home is this ultimate sovereign space that the international order idealizes, a place of exclusive belonging and universal order. We hear in the promise of statehood and self-determination a longing to be at home somewhere in the world. And so it is that the repeated repressive denial of Palestinian statehood and self-determination and the refusal to recognize and create space for a Palestinian homeland is channeled through and given official form by international legal processes, institutions, and actors as they go about their homemaking, their thresholding work. Finally, and more explicitly on this point, Israel has deployed international law over the past 20 months to facilitate the unmaking of home in Gaza by calling on the laws of war to justify and authorize a shift in the classification of Gaza's homes from protected places into military targets. This makes international law complicit in home destruction whilst also drawing it into a larger myth about Gazans as people without a home, without a connection to a soil of significance, which of course is a dehumanizing and distortive narrative, a discourse of erasure and historical revision, which Israel has been constructing for decades. So with no protection for home in international law or prohibition of its destruction, and notwithstanding international law's complicity in the unmaking of home in Gaza, recently, there have been calls to make domicide an actual crime under international law. Some might argue that criminalising domicide is unnecessary because home destruction falls within existing categories of international crime, such as war crimes. It can also be said that home destruction is comparable to a crime against humanity, where, as often happens, it results in forced transfer, apartheid, and other inhumane acts. Home destruction may also precipitate genocide. In the ICJ's January 2024 order, the court mentioned home 8 times in a short 29-page judgment, underlining the link between home destruction and genocide. That link is not without historical precedent. In Myanmar and Rwanda, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, genocide and domicide were tightly entwined. These are important legal and historical comparisons. They also provide an opening for the conversation I think we need to have about home, in which home is conceptualized in that much richer sense that I've talked about today, much more than just being a material place. And a conversation about why it's important to think about home through its absence and its erasure. And it's the latter where domicide comes in. I think the value of domicide is that it draws attention to the political nature of the home space. So domicide, quick definition, scholars have defined it as the deliberate destruction of home by human agency in the pursuit of specific goals, causing suffering. Like home, domicide is multifaceted. It has diverse temporalities, different affective registers, different modes. Domicide is home destruction that occurs again and again, spanning different locations and incorporating different intents and methods. It's operationalized in many ways. These will be familiar to us all, especially Jeff. The self-destruction of homes, the denial of residency rights and the right of return, restriction of access to building materials and natural resources, discriminatory zoning and planning restrictions, and deviant urbanization programs. Domicidal processes may or may not result in the physical destruction of home. The point is that they render home uninhabitable and deny the conditions for homemaking, materially and psychologically. Domicide keeps a community in a state of continual upheaval, without continuity, as Nadira just said, prohibited from resettling and making home, living in constant uncertainty and without a sense of permanence. So this conceptualization of domicide marks a shift from it being seen as a singular event or a once-off to a process that's neither linear or instant or finite, but one which unfolds and repeats. And that repetition really underscores the intentional and systematic nature of it and the logic of violent erasure that drives it. Criminalising domicide under international law would not stop the destruction of home. Let's not pretend. And to the extent that international law refuses, indeed fails to act on home destruction, this can be interpreted as tacit authorisation or complicity, as I've said. I think it's more productive to think of the concept of domicide as an organising tool for civil society, for decolonial and anti-imperial resistance. Ignoring harms to home is not only unjust, it's also really convenient for states and other actors for whom home destruction serves strategic ends. When home and its destruction is viewed through the much richer, more complex lens that I've talked about today, domicide becomes about much more than legal accountability for perpetrators and redress for victims, even though those remain important. Domicide is about seeing the violence done to home and through home in support of settler colonialism, ethnic oppression, apartheid, genocide, and other acts that undermine the ability of people to make home. It's also about acknowledging the yearning for home and homeland and the violence done in the name of that yearning, often strategically and often by deploying law, including international law, to facilitate it and legitimise it. Next slide, please. So before we began here at the tribunal, I visited the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo. During the siege of Sarajevo, 65% of the city's homes were destroyed. Sarajevo is, to quote the Architectural Society, a city that does not forget. And indeed, many of the artefacts in this museum, which I urge you to visit, elicit home as a vessel of memories, of sustenance for identity, and a site to resist dispossession and dehumanization. So as a final note, I think we should also be looking at domicide in Palestine through larger geopolitical and geolegal lenses. International law is just one among many other participants in what I call the global regime of unhoming. This comprises all the institutions, systems, structures, arrangements, and logics that determine whether Palestinians can and cannot make a home in the world and where. A larger view of domicide needs to consider also the political economy and racial capitalism of homemaking and unmaking. As Lara urged us yesterday, we must ask, who profits, for example, from plans to rebuild Gaza? When international organisations say it will take millions and years to rebuild, what is their agenda? And do these statements not dangerously ease the way for expulsion from Gaza and permanent displacement? To me, this is all part of the global regime of unhoming, which fuels a politics of belonging that has for too long divided the world into us and them, we who are at home and them, Palestinians, who are made to feel not at home. International law's participation in unhoming does not mean that we have to abandon it or disengage from it, but we should examine its place in the assemblages of power that are connected with home destruction and the narratives of erasure and manufactured estrangement from home, and consider how homemaking work can be redirected towards more just and less violent outcomes. Following Michelle's suggestion yesterday in relation to international courts, how might we transform and reimagine what international law is doing in the space of home? Home is a special place, but it is also, and it should be, a very ordinary place, full of ordinary, everyday things and practices. Home in Gaza today is far from ordinary, but let us hope that it will return to that.
Thank you, Henrietta, Jeff, and Nadra and Penny. We have a good 10 minutes and probably time for 2 questions. Since all the speakers are here, we should use this opportunity to have a short conversation. And then, of course, panelists can also make comments on each other's papers. Any comments and questions from the audience about the 3 papers of this panel? Yes, please. Yes. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Hi. Thank you. This panel was incredible. My question is for Jeff. Can you talk a little bit about the Palestinian Authority and its role in the normalization, pacification process? What you think, if you think there's a role, I think you might, and what you think is the driving force behind that collaboration? Is it simply power? Is it money? Is it all of the above? Is it other things?
To tell you the truth, I feel uncomfortable. I think this would be a better question presented to Palestinians. I feel a little uncomfortable criticizing. It's not on? Or it doesn't? My voice is on. How do you use this one? Okay. I'd rather have a Palestinian maybe answer that, although obviously I have my views. Look, everywhere in a settler colonial project, you have to have the collaborators. There has to be some. I mean, this is something that's interesting that hasn't been explored. There's a relationship between the colonists and the colonized. It isn't simply, it isn't only a matter of repression or violence or displacement, or, it is unilateral, as I tried to say, in terms of the goals of the project, and the rights and the well-being of the indigenous play no role whatsoever in the thoughts of the settlers. But at the same time, they have to adopt different strategies. They have to buy land sometimes. Certainly Zionism in the early phases, they had to buy land. They had to deal with landlords, whether in Beirut or local landlords. They had to deal with the Ottoman authorities. And then of course, already in 1909, you had the first Jewish militias beginning to emerge. The Shomrim, the Guards, and those kinds of groups. So already there was resistance on the part of the peasants who were being displaced but didn't own the land. And so there were all kinds of attempts, and that goes into almost into the present day, of village leagues, of trying to identify. It's like the Americans had identified some Native American and made him a chief of a tribe. So they identified certain Palestinians that they could work with and made them the sheikh or the mukhtar or something like that. So in other words, it's very complicated, but there's a relationship, and I think that follows into this whole thing with the Palestinian Authority. There's a relationship, and obviously the Palestinian Authority. I don't know. I mean, I could say so many things, but it has its interests, and I think it's corrupt. It's a VIP kind of an organization, and it's become this collaborationist regime that dismantles the Palestinian movement in a way. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
We can have another two short questions. One person and the next, and then respond. Yeah, the person in the middle.
Now, I have a question for Jeff. Earlier in your presentation, you said that we need to multitask and we need to have a political solution while during genocide. Would you agree that kind of the example of that is what happened in Bosnia during the war? Because the genocide in Bosnia didn't really stop until we had a political solution to the war, until the war stopped with political negotiations between parties.
All right, so, and last question.
Yes, thank you. I was glad that Nadia was here. I saw her speak at a Cork conference on international law, also online, and I was very impressed with her. I'm sorry that she's not well. I have a question for Professor Zevert, and it's about residential segregation. Now, America, the United States, is built, with rare exceptions, everywhere on residential segregation. I wonder if this is true in so-called Israel between Palestinians and Jews, and if there's been research done on it. Thank you.
I have to. Thanks so much for the question, but I really. Yep. The only thing I can do is defer to Jeff because he is the expert on this. It wouldn't be a good idea for me to answer that rather than him being the expert. Sorry, Jeff, but it's true.
She defers to me, I defer to the Palestinians. This is I know residential segregation is obviously a reality. There's very few places where, even within the same cities where Israelis and Palestinians live together inside Israel, certainly in the occupied territories. Just one little thing I'll say: we know about the wall, the apartheid wall that was built. Do you know in the city of Ramleh, which is a so-called mixed city, right in the middle of Israel, there's a wall between and it's a wall actually mainly of garbage that's been created by the municipality. It's a wall that separates the Palestinian neighborhoods of Ramleh from the Jewish ones. So, you have that phenomenon certainly in very micro forms in many cases.
Maybe you continue the question, answer to.
All right, I'll just say one thing really quick, and that is, the importance of this of the set of colonial, whether it's a set of colonial analysis, as opposed to the conflict analysis, which is by far the mainstream. This is what the politicians and actually Palestinians use the word conflict all the time. So, you're trapped. If you're in this conflict mode, you can't get to a resolution that's just and sustainable. You just can't. It doesn't lead you there because it legitimizes. It doesn't decolonize. It doesn't decolonize the Zionist enterprise, Israel. It doesn't decolonize the power differentials. And there's all kinds of crazy schemes now because people know that the two-state solution is gone. So now even liberal left Zionist Israelis are into one land for all and federations and confederations and canton systems, all kinds of crazy things like that in order to preserve somehow this Jewish entity, even though there's no two-state idea. So the importance, I think, of the set of colonial analysis is it breaks us out of that. And because it has its logic, the logic of what its purposes are and how it works and the processes lead you to the idea, well, how do we decolonize this? What are the causes, what are the mechanisms, the structures of settler colonialism? And so in a very focused way, you can have a plan of decolonization. And then, of course, decolonization, from my point of view, leads to only one political resolution, which is one state, transforming the entire country into a civil democracy of equal rights for everyone. So I think this issue of settler colonialism isn't only an academic issue or even a political issue on its own to understand, but without it, you cannot get to any kind of meaningful resolution.
Thank you to all our panelists. This concludes panel 2, Exposing Dehumanization. After a 10 minutes coffee break, we will be here in 10 minutes in a panel titled Resisting Genocide, moderated by Thomas McManus. So hope to see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.